My name is Sylvia Torti, and I have the great pleasure to be the new president of College of Atlantic. We're so glad that you could join us on this beautiful campus this morning. We have an incredibly important conversation about media and misinformation. We have one of the most preeminent media figures who has navigated the choppy waters of American politics for decades. He's been in the game, he's commented on the game. Joe, we know that you and Mika spend time in Maine, and I just want you to know that we really appreciate you taking time to be with us here today. To introduce our guests, I'd like to welcome Michaela Schweitzer-Blum. She is the executive director of the Maine Center for Public Interest Reporting, a nonprofit, investigative, and in-depth news organization that publishes the Maine Monitor. For those of you who follow the Maine Monitor, you know that they do an incredible job in local journalism. They're really part of the fabric of Maine, and we're so happy that Michaela is with us today.
Thank you, Sylvia. And thank you to the College of the Atlantic for inviting me to introduce the Summer Institute session. Truly, no topic could be closer to my heart than a discussion about the role of media in a democracy. Like Ambassador Eacho, I was a US diplomat. I spent 26 years as a Foreign Service officer defending and advocating for democracy around the world. And 2 years ago, when I retired from the Foreign Service on a Friday, the very next Monday, I began my work promoting the nonpartisan nonprofit work of the Maine Center for the Maine Center for Public Interest Reporting, and our publication, the Maine Monitor. So I come at this topic from a perspective that has much in common with the interests and concerns of our moderator, Ambassador Bill Eacho, and our guest speaker, Mr. Joe Scarborough. To put this topic into context, I want to give you some background facts and figures to make clear just how much we need to care about journalism, democracy, and our future. Journalism has long been recognized as an integral part of a democracy, the fourth estate. Democracy only works if its citizens participate, and to participate, citizens need factual information, independently and impartially given. Ambassador Eacho knows this well. As chair of the board of directors of the International Foundation for Electoral Systems, IFES, Ambassador Eacho helps guide the world's leading nonprofit, helping to build resilient democracies. In a report released by IFES this spring, titled Building Resilience Against Election Influence Operations, IFES identified 4 key elements of a resilient democracy, including investing in fact-based journalism and digital literacy programs for communities most at risk of being targeted. In my diplomatic career, I saw firsthand how corrupt politicians and dictators deliberately targeted news outlets to stop independent reporting. To maintain their hold on power, they needed to keep their citizens in the dark. Democracy dies in darkness, the motto of the Washington Post, is most certainly true. Yet each year in the United States, more communities find themselves with no functioning news outlet. In its most recent report, Northwestern's Medill Local News Initiative cautioned that local news outlets continue to shutter at a steep rate, even steeper in 2023 than in past years. According to the report, if the United States remains on this trajectory, by the end of this year, nationally, we will have lost 1/3 of our newspapers since 2005. Maine is not immune to this trend. 6 in 10 Maine newspaper publishing jobs were cut between 2000 and 2018. This matters. Studies of US communities that lost newspapers showed that without local journalism to bring issues to light and hold lawmakers and others accountable, citizens are less engaged, voter participation declines, and corruption increases, not to mention an increase in misinformation. According to that Medill report, most communities that lose a local newspaper do not get a replacement. The report notes that those communities are typically poorer and tend to have less access to high-speed broadband that would connect them with other reliable news sources. If you were here last night for Tim Alberta's talk, you heard him talk about interviewing John Boehner at the end of his political career. And what John Boehner said had changed most in his political career was the loss of that common set of facts that we get from sharing the same local newspaper or local TV news. At the same time, trust in news remains an abysmal 32% in the United States, according to the Reuters Institute digital news report that was just released. Importantly, though, in that same study, they noted that local TV news and local newspapers remain the most trusted, 62% and 61% respectively, reinforcing the importance of sustaining local news. I haven't touched on AI, and I'm not even going to get there. I'm sure these guys will, but you get it. It's a tough time for journalism in the United States, and the need for journalism could not be greater. As I'm sure Mr. Scarborough will attest, journalists nationwide feel an enormous responsibility right now. How we secure the fourth estate to push back on misinformation and meet the challenges to our democracy, what more important topic could there be? So let's give our attention to Ambassador Bill Eacho and Mr. Joe Scarborough.
Well, thank you, Michaela, and thank you for what you do with the main monitor. We are seeing a decline in, these kind of local news outlets in America. Around the world, we're seeing a significant amount of backsliding towards autocracy in duly elected administrations, and it typically involves the press, because the first thing an autocrat or a would-be autocrat wants to do is control the media. And so you see that happen. I think in Hungary today, Viktor Orban's party controls 86% of the media outlets and the media information system. And this is what they all collaborate, and they tell each other, first thing you got to do is get control of the media. And so, having access to a free press and free information is critical. So this year has been called the year of elections. We have 116 elections in 76 countries with more than half of the world's population, and over 1 billion ballots had been cast by the midpoint of the year. Freedom House says that we have seen continual backsliding and lists 56 countries as not free. The Swedish Research Institute, VDEM, has a democracy report that says 44% of the world's population now lives in an electoral autocracy. So we have to think about how we're going to fight this trend, and how do we push back against it? And do we see more democracies backsliding, or is there some good news perhaps on the horizon? Joe, I want to thank you for being with us this morning. It's terrific for you to be here. We've had discussions about this kind of thing. Right. Do we see more backsliding? Do we see this kind of thing happening around the world? And what concerns you most right now?
Well, I think there's good news and bad news. I want to start with what Michaela said first, though, and tell you how much local news has disappeared. When I first got to Congress, I got elected in '94. When I first got there in the state of Florida, I think we had 6 Tallahassee bureaus and 6 Washington bureaus. And, people would come up to me and they'd say, "Oh, it's terrible what the New York Times said about you this morning." And I said, "I don't really care what the New York Times says about me. I care about what the Pensacola News Journal says about me and the Okaloosa Daily News." Because if a New York Times reporter came up to me, I'd talk to him, say, yeah, give him the facts. But as I said, my mom doesn't read the New York Times every morning. She reads the Pensacola News Journal every morning. And those local reporters again, in Florida, there were six different, I think, DC correspondents. They kept you not only honest, they kept you on your toes. You knew that you were going to have to talk to them the day after the vote, and or when there was an issue that came up. And now, I don't think any cities in the state of Florida. Maybe there's one left, two left. And so I love these billionaires that want to go out and buy publications like The Atlantic. I let people like Jeffrey Goldberg run The Atlantic, and they do an extraordinary job. And the Washington Post was doing a really good job. I'm very concerned about where they are right now, but I would love to see billionaires start investing in local news, because that's the grassroots of democracy. That's where the rubber meets the road, as Ross Perot once said. Also, a follow-up, because local is so important, it's the same thing. Tim Alberta was here last night. I don't know how many of you heard Tim. Tim and I have come from a very similar background. I was a Southern Baptist, and it's very interesting growing up in the Baptist church. You know, we went to church like 12 times a week. But you know, there was a community. So we would be in Sunday school and we'd do prayer requests, and somebody would say, well, we need to pray for the 12 people that Bill Clinton assassinated last night. And all right. And everybody would gently say, Brother so-and-so, you need to stop seeing those Clinton Chronicle videotapes that Jerry Falwell's putting out. They're not true. They're not? No, they're not. So there was always this balance, right? There was a community that kept a lot of the people grounded, which it's not happening now because the pews of churches are emptying out. People are more isolated, and they live online. They live in chat rooms. They live on 4chan, 8chan. I don't know how many chans there are, but it's not good. And so it's the same thing with local news. And I think that poses one of the great challenges. Regarding autocracy versus democracy, and the ambassador and I have talked about this, it's really a good news, bad news story. It's fascinating. We had Ann Applebaum on our show last week to talk about Autocracy, Inc., which is a brilliant book that we were talking about. And sort of we always saw the opening of China in 1979, which actually, oddly enough, started in Mika's father's townhouse in McLean. That's where Deng Xiaoping came for dinner. We would be very lucky at my house to have like the Little League coach come for dinner. But Mika was serving caviar to Deng Xiaoping, and opening relations between China when she was 9 years old in the US. But we always talk about globalism and what it did economically, starting in 79 with the China-US opening. But it's happening with autocracy now, as Ambassador has talked about, and we've talked about, China and Russia and Hungary and Caracas and Cuba, they all help each other. Belarus, across lines. Ann Applebaum said, if what happened in Belarus a couple of years ago, when 1 million of 10 million people in that population went out to protest, the government would have fallen. But it doesn't anymore, because Belarus gets support from China, from Russia, from Hungary, from everybody else. So, but the good news, bad news is, and I'll let you delve into the bad news, because I have to talk about bad news so often every morning on our show. I'm Baptist, but I'm crossing myself, knocking on wood. There have been some remarkable things happening over the last year, and we should celebrate. Instead of just catastrophizing, we should celebrate. And we start in Poland. In Poland, the Law and Justice Party dominated every aspect of that government, of the press, of you name it. And Donald Tusk, perhaps the most European politician in the history of Poland, somehow won. His party won. And Poland is now moving back towards democracy after backsliding for 7 or 8 years. In India, Modi, we kept hearing how Modi had completely taken control of the political system there. I remember, and this is what a nerd I am, I remember, getting the results and I go, oh my God, Modi's not going to have a complete majority.
Right.
It's like, what? It was unbelievable, again, considering how he controlled the levers of power.
He even lost communities that were overwhelmingly Hindu. And his whole shtick has been, you know,
Right,
Hindus first, everybody else second.
right. And scapegoating Muslims. And then you go to Turkey, and Erdogan has done the same thing, using religion and nationalism.
And taking over the press.
And taking over the press. And France, I think France may be one of the more remarkable things that's happened. No, not the opening ceremonies, but good Lord.
Yeah.
But 2 years ago, everybody was saying, oh, Le Pen's party is going to take control of France. You're going to take control of France. We heard it for 2, 3, 4 weeks. Said, no, it's not. And I turned to Willie. I go, Willie, if I had a betting line, I would say instead of Le Pen winning 51-49, I think Macron's going to get 58.5% of the vote. I just threw a number out there. He got 58.5% of the vote because the French were not going to go that far right. Then we heard it again this year, right? For 2 weeks, we heard the French are going to go extreme right, populist, anti-immigrant, you name it. And Macron did an extraordinary thing. He called for an election. He got absolutely savaged by all of his allies and his enemies. Then they had the runoff. And Le Pen's party finished in 3rd place.
Yeah, 30%.
And Macron, it is really extraordinary what he did. He set up a center-right government. So now he has the extremes on the far right and the extremes on the far left hating him, but he's got a pretty reasonable center there. And then, of course, and I'd love to get your input on this, what happened in Caracas is nothing short of extraordinary. Maduro is a dictator.
Yeah.
And he allows this one person basically to run. And you have an extraordinary figure, a
After
woman
turning down 2 candidates saying, no, you're not qualified to run against me. So
right.
Maria Corina Machado is the most popular opposition leader. And he said, no, you can't run. You're not qualified.
Right.
And then they put up another candidate. He said, no. And then they put up a 3rd candidate, this retired diplomat, 74 years old. And he thought, oh, well, I'll beat him easily. Okay, yeah, you can run him. And it looks like he has won with a vote of about 2-1.
Right.
And yet the government has come out and said, oh, no, I won 52-45 or whatever.
Yeah.
They made up a number. Now it'll be interesting to see what happens because the people are protesting in the streets. There's some violence about it. Can the people's will be overcome a dictator who says no?
And I will say in the United States domestically, there, again, a lot of catastrophizing. And I would say a lot of catastrophizing goes on in my house. And I asked her if she'd like to go around and take a walk around the neighborhood. She said no. But you look back to January 6th and what happened before and after January the 6th. And it's remarkable. 63 federal judges said no to the big lie. And a lot of them appointed by Donald Trump. The US Supreme Court said no. There was no widespread election fraud. They even had Alito and Thomas writing an opinion, a dissenting opinion saying, we should have taken this case, but even if we had taken this case, it would not have impacted the outcome of the election. So we saw Madisonian democracy hold in 2020 and 2021 because of federal judges. And I think that's something we celebrate. And just to let you know, because I really didn't start understanding this until I started traveling abroad post January the 6th. We did a show in Auschwitz, and then we went up to an event in Warsaw for the 80th anniversary of the Warsaw Uprising. And we had Marian Tursky, 96-year-old Auschwitz survivor. And he stood up in front of us, a group of Americans and Poles, and he said, you don't understand. You have no idea what happened across the world on January the 6th. He said, we were all watching. We were all praying. He said, I had seen this before in the 1930s. I knew where it ended. And he said, and you Americans, he goes, you don't understand, but you won. And when you won, we won. Because what happens in Washington impacts Warsaw, impacts, and he just went around the entire world. And it is extraordinary freedom. Just like Autocracy Inc. is, again, there's a group of people together. I think democracy is much stronger. And, you know, I gave a speech a couple months later with John Meacham at Monticello. And I looked at, you know, Jefferson's house and I said, Declaration of Independence, how crazy. A document that has freed more people than any document, political document ever written. And this idea connects in Warsaw, connects with dissidents in Belarus, connects with dissidents in Caracas, connects all around the world. And it's an extraordinary thing, but it is a war. It is a war, a political war between autocracy and democracy.
It is.
I think right now we're winning, but what's some of the bad news out there?
Well, look,
You're
we
playing
have-
the role of Mika right now, by the way. Go ahead.
nowhere near as attractive, but okay. We are winning some and losing some. We had a big win this past year in a country where you'd be surprised that it happened there, Senegal. In African countries, you don't expect this, but the outgoing administration tried to extend their term and say, we can't afford to have elections yet. And they tried to get the constitution changed so they could extend their mandate and ignore their term limits. And the Constitutional Court in Senegal overruled the administration and said, no, you're going. And they had a free and fair election and the new administration was installed. That's success, right? And you don't expect that in Africa, in an African country. In Indonesia, we saw millions vote. You know, you can complain about the results, et cetera, but in Mexico, we have a woman running the country. So there are some positives, but there are also negatives. In Slovakia, we saw a right-wing, a pro-Russia party win 2 days after a deep fake audio was released of the head of the Progressive Party saying he had the election rigged. The whole thing was fake, but his party lost, you know? So this idea of disinformation is real and they do use it. And we are seeing at IFAS, we see the Russian influence and the Chinese influence is massive in terms of this disinformation online and trying to feed. They want to create divisiveness. They want to make democracy look bad because then that makes autocracy look good, right? So, you know, there's good news and bad news out there. Who knows what's going to happen at the end of the day in Venezuela? We'll see. And hopefully the good guys win.
You know, the difference also is for many of us growing up, you know, we either remember or we read about Soviet tanks going into Hungary in '56, going into Czechoslovakia in '68. And that's what we think of when we think of autocrats. But it's just not that way anymore. The tanks don't roll in. Usually force is not used. What happens instead is Orban gets elected in Hungary and he goes to the media, the people that run the media companies there and bugs journalists' phones. Then he goes to the people there that run media companies, the biggest media companies, and they say, you're committed tax fraud. Tax authorities are coming after you. We've seized all of your assets. You can either leave the country and leave your company with us, or you can spend the rest of your life in jail. And so they leave the country. And this is how systematically Orban has gained control of about, 80, what do you say, 85%
of the country?
86%
The press.
of the press in Hungary. Now, again, remarkably, the Law and Justice Party in Poland had done about the same thing. They used an industrial group. I think it may have been a railroad to buy up all these newspapers that were pro-law and justice party. But that's how it's done these days. You basically push media companies and journalists out of the country through intimidation. You change the courts, you rig the courts, and it's very subtle.
And Orban has also, he kicked out the leading university.
Right.
The Central European University was based there. And he basically said, I'm withdrawing your license to teach. You got to leave.
Right.
And because he didn't want an independent university teaching students that all about freedom and democracy.
And he actually brags about being illiberal. And it brags about destroying Western democracy, liberal democracy, freedom of the press, freedom of the judiciary. And I think it's reasonable. I think it would be unreasonable not to be concerned that Donald Trump's, one of his closest allies globally is Viktor Orban. You know, people are always talking about what would a second Trump administration look like. It's pretty easy. Just look at what Viktor Orban has done in Hungary, and that's what he'll try to do. We'll see if he gets elected, if that's in fact what he's able to do.
Yeah, sometimes it happens, boom, like in Tunisia a few years ago, a president won the presidency with 73% of the vote. He immediately suspended the parliament, dismissed the prime minister, assumed executive powers, drafted a new constitution, and consolidated his control. So he became a dictator. Now that can happen in some places. Most of the time, it's gradual, and you don't see it happening. It's behind the scenes.
Right.
Like, you know, Erdogan in Turkey and Orban in Hungary, they've gradually consolidated control. They've made it difficult to run press against them, like you say,
Right.
investigate them for tax purposes. And, you know, these countries, they also coordinate with each other. So when the Russia disinformation system puts out some crazy story, the Chinese disinformation system picks up on it and starts retweeting it. And they're all over Africa now. China has an organization called Star TV in Africa, which is a paid television subscription service. It's only a few dollars a month, so everybody subscribes, but it's putting out Chinese disinformation.
Do you know what else is? This unknown social media organ called TikTok. I mean, the Chinese government will actually manipulate the algorithms. And if you don't believe that, start posting about Tiananmen Square. Start posting about the crackdown in Hong Kong. I mean, it is, people keep telling me I have to get on TikTok. This is the TikTok election. You should see what Kamala Harris is doing on TikTok. You should see the response. And I haven't been able to do that yet, but I do think it's extraordinary. It would be like the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite, brought to you by Chairman Al. I mean, who would put up with that? None of us would. So, but disinformation spreads a lot of different ways. And again, that algorithm, it's pretty incredible what spreads not only there, but on X. You talked about this Russian disinformation that is fed directly onto X.
Yeah.
That Elon
And then it gets
Musk's
picked up.
friends tweet out.
David Sachs, Elon Musk's PayPal buddy, retweeted a story that the Russian different disinformation system put out that basically said the Russian, I think the one he retweeted, the Russian massacre of the massacre that occurred in Russia of civilians at Bucha, or they occurred in Ukraine, was faked. There was a story that there were bioweapons in Ukraine. And then this gets fed out. And then David Sachs retweets it and it gets 2.5 million views. And then Elon Musk retweets it. Elon Musk just retweeted a fake news video of Kamala,
Right.
which is kind of obviously fake, but still, you know, people see it and it's feeding a propaganda message. As Tucker Carlson picks this stuff up.
Well, you know, I'm playing the optimist here. We've seen across the world, we've seen people that have picked up propaganda and understand propaganda. In fact, what was a country that actually the race was against corruption and propaganda?
Yeah, there was a spinoff party that actually just did well in in Turkey, a spinoff of Erdogan's party, and they ran on a anti-corruption, anti-propaganda platform and got 30% of the vote in this recent EU election.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think it was Turkey. Let me look at my notes here.
Well, but the
you know,
main thing is, though, people are getting tuned to the propaganda, whether it's coming on social media, whether it's coming through AI. So it is a brave new world. But again, I remain
we have to be
optimistic.
vigilant, and you have.
Oh, we have to be
but people can
vigilant, yeah.
tell. I think
Yeah.
this stuff is kind of obvious. If it's obviously disinformation,
Right.
it probably is.
Yeah.
Maybe not. Why? It was. David Sachs retweeted the story that Ukraine was tied to ISIS's attack on a Moscow concert hall. Now, come on, Ukraine as
Yeah.
ISIS,
Right.
like that's obviously stupid.
Right.
But he retweeted it, and it got a lot of views.
Yeah.
And the problem is they feed on each other, these disinformation networks out there. And the Chinese have now created these so-called news agencies and cooperative, these organizations to push this stuff out.
Yeah.
And we saw this some years ago when Macron was running in 2017. There was a fake Belgian news agency that said Saudi Arabia was financing Macron because they wanted to tie him to Arab migrants.
Right.
It was absurd. But this is the stuff that you see out there. So you got to be careful of what you watch.
Yeah.
And in one case, this whole idea that the Sputnik News the Russian organization put out this thing that there were birds being used as bioweapons from Ukrainian labs funded by the United States. And the UN Security Council had to listen to the Russian ambassador complain about that in a Security Council meeting. It was totally fake news, but it makes us look bad, so they're gonna put it out there.
Yeah, and I think that's a challenge for American politics is, again, where people get their news, where they get their sources. I know that I would have friends after the 2020 election that I grew up with, because most of the friends that I grew up with, I was born in Atlanta and moved to Mississippi and Northwest Florida, also called the Redneck Riviera, also called LA, Lower Alabama. And there are a lot of names for it. AA, America's Albania. But anyway, I get calls all the time about all of these conspiracy theories that have since been sort of snuffed out. And I'd say, now, where are you getting this? Because it's important. Where are you getting this? They say, oh, Epic Times. I say, oh, Epic Times, you mean the website that is run by a Chinese religious cult that began as a left-wing front for a Chinese religious cult, but they didn't get enough pickup, so they changed it to being a right-wing website for that fronts a Chinese religious cult, and then they do other websites, and I'd say, okay, well, let's talk through this. And I talk to them, and they say, oh, I just can't trust news. I've just tuned out. I don't watch news anymore. I go, okay. So where do you get your news? And they get it at website. They get it at the, bizarre websites. And I always say, well, read the Wall Street Journal. Got some great journalists there. That's a Murdoch paper. Get your news there. Get your news at the AP. Get your news at Reuters, get your news, but the problem is so many people are being bombarded with so much bad information that they have the ability to be self-selecting. So they self-select, and if somebody's saying something they don't want to hear, they'll change the channel and go to a station where somebody's reaffirming all of their pre-existing beliefs and all of their pre-existing prejudices.
And when you go to Reuters, you got to also be careful that it's the real Reuters, because the Russians did also put out a fake version of Reuters that had if it didn't end in Reuters.com, it was Reuters something else. And it put out fake press releases and a fake NATO press release. It was just, so be careful, right?
Yeah.
And now they've, Ann Applebaum wrote about it, I think in last month's Atlantic Monthly,
Right.
and now they've taken it down.
Yeah.
But,
Mm.
people be careful. Do you think that we have a handle on this disinformation thing now? That, we're getting better at sussing it out?
I think we're getting better at it. I still think it's as grim sometimes as Maine weather when you're expecting to take your friends out on your lobster boat later in the day. But I think we're getting a better handle on it. I think people are a lot wiser. I know, in the Soviet Union, toward the end, a lot of Russians became extraordinarily successful of whatever they heard from the government. And I think we're starting to get that. I think a lot of Americans are starting to understand that they have to maybe go a level deeper. I think, though, the crisis of not having a news source that a good number of Americans trust is a real concern. I mean, I remember growing up, my dad, because Walter Cronkite opposed the Vietnam War after Tet, my dad would always say, Cronkite's a commie. But my dad watched CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite every night. And when Walter said, that's the way it is, my dad believed him. And you don't see that enough. And you don't see that enough because the press has made mistakes through the years. But I think more to the point, you have politicians calling, using Soviet terms like enemy of the people to go after people in the media nonstop. And you also have, I think you have a fear, not only from some media people, but also from corporations, that Donald Trump may actually win in 2024. And I just wonder if sometimes some of them are sort of trimming their sails. Because, and this is my opinion, and not the ambassadors or anybody else's. And by the way, this is mild compared to what you would have heard if Mika came here. But this is an election. This is not, in my opinion, an election like any other election. And when news reporters and anchors try to act like it is, that it's like 1996, Bill Clinton versus Bob Dole, I think they're doing their viewers a grave disservice, because this is an election where you have one candidate talking about autocracy, talking about Viktor Orban being a role model, talking about being a dictator on day one. Sean Hannity says, you're joking, right? No, I'm going to be a dictator on day one. Telling a group of Christians, vote for me now. You won't have to vote 4 years from now. You won't have to vote anymore. Donald Trump supporters say, oh, he was just joking. Laura Ingraham asks, you were just joking, right? No, he repeats it again. Then he talks about terminating the Constitution, talks about executing his chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley. He talks about trying media corporations for treason. I could go, the list goes on forever and ever. And so I don't think we can treat this election like any other election. And if I'm not saying that the media goes all in for one side or the other, but I am saying, let's keep everything in context. Let's not, like, for instance, conservatives for a year or two after January the 6th, and this was their line. Oh, you think January 6th is bad? Did you see what Joe Biden did on student loans? That is true. That's their argument. And I said, I think the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional, parts of it, excuse me, ruled it, thank you, parts of it unconstitutional, and then he listened, went back and readjusted it. But there's always this false moral equivalency that drives me absolutely crazy. And as well as one person in the back. So all I want is perspective. I want people to have, I want people to have context. I want them to have perspective of where we are right now. And if they, whatever direction they choose, okay, that's democracy, and they choose that direction. But pretending that this is 1996 and there aren't dramatic consequences to this election, I think is a very, very dangerous thing to do.
I can't comment on that because I chair a bipartisan board at IFAS, and I was introduced as the chair of IFAS, so I won't comment. But I got to say, personally, you make good points. I think that, you know, as one election official put it, with what's going on, you know, we have to inoculate the population against disinformation. We have to encourage people to find good sources of information. That happens through voter education, right? Information, getting the word out. Young people today get their news through their phone, right? Through some kind of an app. You know, it's, I don't know what it is.
It's TikTok, it's
whatever.
Instagram Reels,
and
that's it.
It's kind of scary, but.
Well, it is. I will say this, though. If that's the battlefield politically that you have to fight on, you better get good at it.
Yeah.
I don't get it because I'm an old dude. But Josh Shapiro on TikTok does things that I would never do. Nothing bad. Just, you know, walking in slow motion to sign a bill about, I don't know, the Central Pennsylvania water management district or something. Here come the man. Here come the man. And I'm like, but it works. And I think that guy may be the vice president's choice for vice president.
We'll see.
Yeah.
You know, I think we have to rely on a free press. I think we have to be thankful for organizations like the Main Monitor. In Sweden, they actually have an agency for psychological defense. You can Google it. And their whole role is to protect the population from disinformation.
Right.
And, you know, and yet in our country, we kind of almost shut them down.
Right.
You know,
do we,
mind bug.
I don't want to break the, I don't want to be a disruptor here, but do we get to talk to the audience?
Yeah, I think we're supposed to go to that now. Sean, is it time for Q&A? Okay.
Thank you very much.
Let me bring up one other topic.
Yes, sir.
We've seen political violence in this election, the attack on Donald Trump. We saw it in the recent Mexican elections.
Right.
Many candidates were actually murdered.
Yep.
Do you worry about your own security being a member of the press?
Well, you get enough death threats and you end up on enough kill lists and you end up having enough manifestos sent. Yeah, a little bit. I don't know. I mean, it's crazy, you know, it's really crazy and it's really surreal, but it's just, that's kind of been the environment. I really am thinking I want to go to the NFL now and then maybe do, you know, Sunday night football and maybe occasionally have a Bengals fan get really pissed off at me or something and say you suck at your job instead of having to worry about security. But I am very concerned about security. And I just want to bring up one other thing, just one side note too, that I don't think is getting enough play in the press. I think it is getting play on Fox News 24 hours a day. I haven't seen the rest of the press pick it up enough. The security lapses at Butler, Pennsylvania were the most shocking since November 22nd, 1963. Just shocking. Everything about it shocking. They left the roof, and I know people say, oh, the Secret Service are great. Yeah, they're great. They're great, but they didn't do their job that day. And I have no idea. You think about all the security lapses. They leave that building, like unsupervised, and they have a SWAT team that's sitting inside the building. Inside the building. They are warned that a guy is walking around for what, 60, 70 minutes with a scope? With a scope? They see him going up on the roof, and you have people shouting. And it is mind-boggling the number of mistakes the Secret Service made. And I know the Secret Service director resigned. She should have been fired that day. But there have to be a lot more questions asked about how that happened. Because I will tell you, talking about political violence, every death is a tragedy. Every death is a tragedy. The assassination of a political figure does grave violence to this country and to American democracy. This country, I mean, you just really read history and you look at America before November 22nd, 1963. And then you look at it on November 23rd, 1963. Two countries, and I'm not so sure we ever recovered from the assassination of JFK. And I know the Democratic Party never recovered from the assassination of his brother 5 years later on June 6, 1968, the assassination of RFK. We have to do everything we can do to curb political violence. I would say also, you know, a lot of people got angry when there was so much focus on the storming of the Capitol on January the 6th. And they said, well, what about the riots that happened across the United States? I'm a conservative. I've always been a conservative. Break glass and go in and try to take property, you need to be handcuffed and you need to be sent to jail. And you need to stay there for a while, right? Yeah. That's bad. Storming the United States Capitol is political violence that takes it to a new level. And the fact that we have one presidential candidate calling those people that stormed the Capitol and beat the hell out of cops with American flags that were used as weapons, calling those people hostages when there are real hostages that are underground in Gaza still today because the terrorists, Hamas, won't release them. There is no comparison. And I will tell you, I say that, again, feeling great sympathy for a lot of people that were swept up on January 6th because of disinformation. Their lives, a lot of their lives have been ruined because they were swept up by that disinformation. And some really irresponsible politicians. But yeah, political violence, it's a grave threat to our country, to our system.
Can we get some questions from the audience now, John?
There you go, Bill. Spectacular. Whoa. Hello. Andy Revkin, longtime journalist. Mike, I want to circle back to the very beginning and billionaires and local news. Sinclair Broadcasting shows that there are billionaires who are happy to invest in local news. They don't happen to share the some of the traditions of objectivity that you're talking about. What is keeping billionaires from filling that gap that you were talking about? And maybe talk about Report for America and some of the things that people could do at the local level to sustain that capacity that's so necessary.
Yeah, I don't think it's as exciting maybe. Silicon Valley cocktail parties to say, hey, I just bought a series of Central Ohio newspapers, weeklies, than it is to say, again, I have great respect for what's happening at the Atlantic, for what has happened at the Washington Post. But yeah, I don't think it's as snazzy. It's not as exciting, but it's something that's critical. I would hope that people with money that really want to do something in the media, that yes, they can look at some of these bigger publications that may have better reputations, stellar reputations. But again, the heart and soul of American democracy is in the local paper. It's in the letters to the editor. It's having something that pulls the community together. I was talking yesterday, and this is something might surprise some of you, to my former speaker, Newt Gingrich. And I was asking Speaker Gingrich why Georgia seemed to be a one-off as far as Republican politics go. And we were asking about Kamala Harris and her chances to win Georgia. And because think about Georgia, they actually have a governor and a Secretary of State who stood up to Donald Trump. In every other state in America, and every other Republican Party in America, except for maybe Utah, that gets you beaten in primaries. These guys, Brian Kemp and Brad Raffensperger, won 2-1 against the Trump-picked Republican candidates in their primaries. You also have, if people are saying, well, gee, if they get Josh Shapiro, there will be a black woman and a Jewish man on the ticket, how would they ever win in the Deep South? Georgia has 2 senators. One is Jewish and one is a black preacher. But I asked Newt, why is Georgia different? And he said, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. And he said, in other states, newspapers have fallen off. They don't speak to the entire state. He said, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution steadies the ship. And so if Brian Kemp is doing something or Brad Raffensperger is recording a phone call that may cause real concerns, that Republican, Independent, Democrat is going to wake up, and after they see whether the Braves won or lost, or if the Falcons lost or lost, they will go back to, I'm born in Atlanta, so I've been suffering with the Falcons since 1966. They will go and they will read it, and they'll go letters to the editor, they'll go editorial page, they'll do the front page, and the Atlanta Journal-Constitution still packs a punch. I just can't think of a more noble calling for somebody that wants to help American journalism than investing in local newspapers, not to push a point of view, but to report the news.
You're here. Sean, you've got somebody else? I can't see.
Oh, right here. Yes,
Yes, 2 suggestions and a question.
yes.
When the media talks about Donald Trump, one of the things you never say is, you want to be commander in chief. Mr. Trump, do you realize no military branch would let a felon become a member of the military? And yet you're a convicted felon and you want to run the military. The other thing the media should ask.
Mika will say that. Go ahead. What's your second thing?
The other thing Trump should be asked is, you caused damage on January 6th to the Capitol, basically $160 million the taxpayers have had to pay for. Donald, we need to take that out of your funds to pay for restoration of the Capitol. All right. So 2 quick suggestions, Joe, and we love you. Everybody here loves you and Mika. Okay, watch your show. Question. Is anybody in the media talking to Rex Tillerson, General Milley, and the other 40 or so people who've left Trump's administration about coming up with a national statement, say sometime in September, we all worked for Trump, we left Trump, he's a con man, he's a liar, he's a criminal, America cannot vote for this man. All those people who work for Trump, a joint statement, a television appearance,
Right.
something. Please work on that and get these influential people talking.
Let me just say, not my job. That is the job, I think, of a lot of people who are trying to get people like Mad Dog Mattis, and you said Rex Tillerson and everybody else. It's an extraordinary number of people. And of course, General Kelly has confirmed that when he was, whose son died in combat, that Donald Trump actually did say what he said about people that died for their country being suckers and losers. So I suspect you'll probably see that as we move into the fall. But no information, but I think so.
Next over here.
Yeah, good morning. David Gibson, Director of Energy here at COA. I'm curious, I want to push back on your comments relating to billionaires. And I'm curious if you could comment on the influence that billionaires are having on the election through super PACs and being able to dump unlimited funding in. And then further, it seems to me that we'd be better off taxing billionaires and then providing public funding for media and public funding for free and fair elections.
So for those of you, thank you for your question, who have made the mistake of thinking because I am scared of Donald Trump, so I therefore am not still a conservative. I thank you for your question because I couldn't disagree more. I don't think we want more federal control or more government control of the media, more government control of local newspapers. The only reason I say billionaires is because they've got the money. We can talk about taxes. I mean, I'll gladly. I've said it for quite some time. You know, we conservatives always talk about the redistribution of wealth. The greatest redistribution of wealth in world history has gone from working class Americans and middle class Americans to the ultra rich over the past 30 years, over the last 40 years. And the fact, thanks to, hold on. Listen, hold on. If you're going to do that, I want you to do it with gusto. Can you shout it? Hold on, let's try this again. Thanks to, all right, very good. I would disagree. Well, you know, I think what you have is you've had since the 1980s, the mid-1980s, conservatives, more conservatives, and by the way, Kurt Anderson has an extraordinary book on this, about how the wealthy have used think tanks and used other outside groups to impact the Republican Party. Because certainly Dwight Eisenhower wouldn't have believed in a tax system like this. And I'll tell you, I, who am a conservative, was part of the Congress that balanced the budget 4 years in a row, the only time in the last century. I've always been offended by the fact that billionaires basically pay, in effect, 6% tax rate. Well, somebody who is working and a small business owner who's making pretty good money in New York or Connecticut or Illinois or New Jersey or California are paying about 55, 60% of their income. I mean, think about that. Perhaps 60% of their income is going to taxes. And yet billionaires are paying about 6%. We're not taking care of carried interest. We're not taking care of, you know, the fact that, again, somebody like Jeff Bezos can make a couple $1 billion in a day during COVID, and he doesn't have to report that.
How would you fix it?
What's that?
How would you fix it?
Well, you'd have to figure out a way, especially with billionaires, to go after capital, to figure out how to tax capital, because we figured out how to tax income. We figured out how to tax people who work hard. We figured out how to tax people who work 40, 50, 60 hours a week. We figured out how to tax small business owners. We figured out how to tax small family restaurants. But we somehow can't figure out if somebody makes $5, $10, $20 billion a year in investments. We can't say, oh, we can't tax them right now because they may roll it over to another investment. I just think that's absolutely outrageous.
It sounds just like Bernie.
So this is what I love about what I do. I've just been called a right-winger that is responsible for the downfall of the economic system. And you just called me a socialist. I love America. You know, by the way, I've been saying that really since I was called a right-wing extremist in Congress. And it just tells you, it's just, you know.
I think we've got one more question over here.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask how you thought the media, or the extent to which the media played into Joe Biden's recent decision to not seek re-election.
I think it really was more people inside the Democratic Party. I think history will probably show that it was mainly Nancy Pelosi and Joe Biden, a guy that I know and I love, and I've known him for a very long time. Joe was going to hold on. The president was going to hold on. And then the polls started coming back, and Nancy started saying that she was losing, that the House was going to be lost. Democrats believe they can win the House. And the internal numbers were so bad for the Democrats in the House, especially in the swing districts. They were so bad for Democrats in the Senate. I think at that point, they really started moving and telling him he just really didn't have any choice. So they also, the small donations had dropped, larger donations were completely frozen. So I think that played a big role. The media was reporting it, reporting these happenings, but I think it was mainly the Democrats who understood that he just wasn't going to do as well as somebody who replaced him.
All right.
Sean, are we,
I'm right over here. We're going to take one more.
okay. Harold, hang on a second. Harold, why don't we come back to you?
Well,
You want to repeat it?
I can repeat it. Harold asked, and we'll get you really quick. I can answer really quickly. Harold asked what we can do about angry white rage. And I will tell you, Mika has me in DBT training sessions, and it's helping. Mindfulness helps a great deal. So, it's very interesting. I do want to say this. Everybody says America's racist, America's racist, America's racist. And, oh, those people in Iowa are racist. Oh, those people here are racist. Oh, those people. I just want to remind everybody that Barack Obama in 2008 was the first time a majority white country elected a person of color to be their leader. And you can look at the counties in Iowa, in particular, that voted for Barack Obama in 8 and 16, that voted for Donald Trump in 20. And instead of calling them racist, I think we need to ask, why did they switch from a guy who talked about hope and change to a guy who talked about American carnage? And that's a question. I mean, I don't think they were enlightened in 8 and 12 and turned to racist in 16. I think there's a bigger question there that Democrats need to figure out if they want to win.
So true. Right
I'd
over
like
here.
to talk about access to news, getting back to that. I live in North Carolina, and McClatchy has been, in effect, bought out by a large organization. The cost of a yearly subscription is over $1,000. My son cannot afford that, so he gets his news freely. And I think that's a large reason why a lot of young people and people who don't make a lot of money are going to free options. So when you're talking about why people don't look at regular news outlets, you must consider that. Do you have any comments?
Well, yeah, I mean, I agree with you. And I think it's if you look at where media has gone, you can, whether it's newspapers, whether it's online sites that have the paywalls, you could look at cable news. You could look at, people are cutting the wire or whatever, as I say, and not getting cable anymore. They'll get some streaming services, but aren't getting their news that way. And it's the same thing with local newspapers that have paywalls. I would hope, when I talk about people going in and and investing in local news, investing in a local journalist, investing in local reporting. I would hope they would do that in a way where they don't have to put up paywalls to make that work. Because you're exactly right. If we want younger Americans, if we want working Americans, if we want other people who are struggling, you know, just to pay their grocery bill, pay their gas bill, and pay their rent or their mortgage, then we've got to figure out how to meet them halfway.
No question. Listen, I want to thank Joe for joining us this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Bill, and thank you, Joe. It was riveting. I just want to remind you that we have a double session this morning. So we have an 11 o'clock session. Please grab another thing to drink and then meet us back here in about 20 minutes. And please be patient with the parking situation. We know we've got some parking jammed up this morning, so it might take a little bit of time to help you all leave when you do leave. So thank you for that.
Oh, need it.